and we can jump right into it. So welcome to the Right Tree, Right Place talk. My name is Mike Yarak. I'm the Urban Forestry Program Manager at Friends of the Urban Forest. This talk will also be moderated by Anna Wright, who's our Restoration Planting Manager here at Friends of the Urban Forest. So everybody say hi to Anna in the chat. She will be fielding all of your questions so that we can open this up for discussion. So, right tree, right place. This is one of the questions that planting leaders ask quite a bit is, why did you select this tree for this site? And so in the field of arboriculture, we have a concept we call right tree, right place, which is basically thinking about the tree selection and the site selection in tandem as co-equal important parts of the equation of where to put the right tree. So this consists of three main factors. The first is microclimate, second is site-specific factor, and so San Francisco is in the Sunset Climate Zone 17, USDA Hardiness Zone 10B, which basically means that we have really wet winters, a lot of fog, and not a lot of frost or freezing. So we like to think about microclimate as opposed to macroclimate, because we have a lot of difference in climate from one neighborhood to the next, from one side of the street to the next. So that's very important to take a close look at. We also live in a very dense urban city, so the site-specific factors, streetlights, fire escapes, traffic signals, things like that are also very important. Utilities above and below ground. And lastly, cultural sensitivity. So there are some topics we'll talk about where the cultural or the aesthetic design plays a significant role in selecting trees for a site. The first thing we want to do is put the place in the right tree, right place. So these are areas that Friends of the Urban Forest is focusing on for the next 3 years. This map, anywhere that's shaded, this maps very, very closely to street tree canopy cover in San Francisco and also income. So these are areas that we have funding for the next 3 years. And every tree that we plant in these shaded areas will be watered by Public Works. The one exception, their attention to this green circle in the Richmond will be watered by Friends of the Urban Forest. So our main goal in this, in showing you this, is to let you know that we're really focusing on environmental benefit and equity in the distribution of canopy in our city. This is a soil map of San Francisco. You can see just how different the soils are by neighborhood. It's also really interesting to see over here with the legend that sand is really the dominant soil type in our city. You also have a lot of sandy loam. And these are areas that are also kind of corresponding with those really nice, healthy, vigorous trees. Areas like, Castro, Eureka Valley, Noe Valley, Mission, Dogpatch, Potrero. So when we think about sites in microclimate, we don't just think about the temperature, the weather, we think about the soil, because they really do, they have a lot of interplay and they are equally as important. So looking at the weather, the microclimate, San Francisco roughly falls into 3 climate zones. So zone 1 on the west side of the city is what we call the coastal or the fog belt. This is an intensely coastally influenced ecosystem. So you have the Pacific Ocean right there. You get a lot of cold wind whipping right off the ocean, a lot of salt spray. Even as you get close to the beach, La Playa, you get some saltwater intrusion into the soils. So it's a very, very tough growing, a lot of tough growing conditions for the trees that are planted out there. It's also, because it's foggy, it gets a lot less heat and a lot less sunlight, which just further stresses the trees that are growing in the western side of the city. Zone 2, kind of running the middle of the city, follows the elevation of Twin Peaks and of other hills. So those peaks kind of create a barrier between the fog belt on the west side of the city and the sun belt on the east side. So in the transition zone, you get a lot of variation block to block. You get areas that are almost look like they could be in the fog belt, and then right around the corner, you get a really nice pocket of great weather, great growing conditions. So it really is a transitional zone. It's not right in the middle. There's a lot of areas that look like the fog belt, a lot of areas that look like the sun belt, and conditions can vary within feet of each other. The zone 3 on the east side of the city is what we call the sun belt. So it not only gets drenched in sun because the central elevation gain in the middle of the city kind of blocks that fog layer. It also blocks the wind. So zone 3, the sun belt, is really blessed with great soils by and large, a lot of sun, and also some wind protection. So they get the highest variety of tree species can be planted in the sun belt, and typically great growing conditions out there. And this is just a picture, so you know I'm not lying to you. It really is pretty stark in terms of having completely different microclimates from one side of the city to the other, or even from one neighborhood to another, or one side of the block to another. All right, so we have our microclimate poll. So the first quiz for today, we're gonna give about a minute per question. So this one is, what is the most common soil type in San Francisco? Just making sure everybody is paying attention and at their computer ready to be engaged. All right, we have about half of the people have responded. We have about 30 seconds left on our poll. So again, what's the most common soil type in San Francisco? Think back to that soil map that showed all the different soil types throughout the city. We have about 15 more seconds. I also want to remind everybody to please use the chat. If you have any questions about the first part of the presentation, which is the microclimates as they shift from west to east in San Francisco, please put them in the chat. And with that, we've hit 1 minute on the poll, so we will close it. We had 13 total respondents, and 11 of the 13 are going with sand. And that is the correct answer. So everybody give yourself a pat on the back. Loam is heavily represented, so don't feel bad if you put loam in. 2 of us did, and that's totally okay. So we can move on to delving a little bit more into the fog belt. So again, sand. These are 2 images of the Sunset District. On the left, we have, this is kind of an aerial view of the sunset. You have Golden Gate Park at the top of the photo. You have Sunset Boulevard on the far left. You can see it's actually not complete in this photo. You have Slope Boulevard on the bottom, Stern Grove kind of peeking in from the right here. This is the far western side of Stern Grove. And then you have Sunset Reservoir up here in the middle. So you can really see, and on the right, this is the construction of Sunset Boulevard. So you can really see that not only is this a neighborhood, a part of the city that's drenched in fog, it has extreme coastal influence, it also is a sand dune. We are literally planting in pure sand. So when we have planting events in the outer Sunset, we're taking all of this into account. So not only what grows well in areas with lots of wind, lots of salt, but in sand, which is very, very high drainage, very mineral and nutrient poor. So those conditions are really tough. And because of that, we really lean heavily on a select few species for the west side of the city. So living in San Francisco, this tree should not be a surprise to anybody. It's very commonly planted. This is something that we try to mainly plant on the west side of the city because it is known for being a very large tree. It does have a propensity for hardscape damage if planted out of place. But you can see this picture on the left is a pretty good example of where it grows. It's from the coast range of New Zealand. It actually is generally kind of found on these coastal bluffs. So it develops these aerial roots which aid in stabilization, aid in water uptake. So it's a very beachy tree, and we find that pulling from places like New Zealand with Mediterranean climate like ours, and then also pulling within that climate for microclimates similar to places that these trees might be planted in San Francisco, really has the best results long-term for tree health outcomes. Another species that we plant almost exclusively on the west side of the city is the Cordyline australis. So this is also known as cabbage palm. Again, one of the only things that will actually grow if you put it on Fulton, like Fulton and La Playa, or Kirkham and 48th. One of the few things that will actually grow. And it's actually nice to see that these do become almost tree-like. We plant them very small, so it's important to see that these do grow. They do put on a lot of growth, and they do really well in the western side of the city. Moving on to the transition zone. So the photo on the left does a really good job. You can see this is a photo probably from Buena Vista Park looking north at the Panhandle. And so you can see that it's not a one size fits all. It really does have these little pockets of nice climate, little pockets of more coastally influenced foggy areas. And I have included a picture on the right of Alamo Square Park because I just associate it with being usually somewhat sunny, but windy as heck. And that's just further indicative of this being kind of, it's hard to pin down. It has a lot of different conditions and they vary from site to site. So to plant trees in the transition zone, we really look for versatility. So the tree like the small-leaf Tristania, also known as the Canuka or water gum, Tristania laurina, is one of the most versatile trees that we plant. It's tolerant of various different soils, so it can tolerate pretty well quick, fast draining soils and also pretty poorly draining soils. Somewhat tolerant of wind. Again, wouldn't plant it on the far west side of the city, maybe on like Fulton or anything like that. But in the transition zone, it does hold up well to even those seasonal gusts. Another species that kind of dominates the transition zone as well as other parts of San Francisco is the Brisbane box. So this is Lophostemon confertus, previously Tristania conferta. And this is another Australian tree. This is a very upright tree. It's kind of selected for having fast growth and this kind of really nice form that fits an urban environment pretty well. It suits a city like San Francisco well because it has this one long trunk, has really good clearance, and it grows quickly so it can get that clearance sooner rather than later, which is important in an urban area like San Francisco. I use this as an example because there's a row of these planted in the median on Portola Street, Portola Drive, kind of going from West Portal up to Twin Peaks. And as you drive along that row of trees, you can kind of track the decline, I'd say, or track the increase in tree health as the climate kind of changes. So towards the peak, it gets a lot more wind gusts up there. And so the trees actually are doing a lot worse than kind of closer down towards the West Portal area where the winds aren't so intense. And so that to me really highlights, the same street, relatively similar orientation of the street, still within that transition zone. And you have vastly different outcomes for the same species on the same street, just as it transverses from one part of the city to another. Lastly, we have the Sun Belt. So this picture on the right, I think really encapsulates that. I believe this picture is from Bernal Hill looking west. And you can really see that that thick fog layer just gets trapped by Twin Peaks. And that leaves this really nice sun-drenched basin that we can plant a lot of trees in. So when we create tree species palettes for different neighborhoods, the Sun Belt, the Mission, Castro, those areas can plant a lot more species than we can plant in Western areas like Outer Sunset. They just have better growing conditions, so we can open up that species palette to a lot wider variety of trees. One of which is the Jacaranda. So this is a species of tree that's native to a subtropical region. So if you try to put it in a place like Outer Sunset, it's just not going to thrive. So we need to be really careful with species like these, that we site them correctly. We give them the areas that are the warmest, have the best wind protection, and have the most sun exposure. And that allows us to, once these trees are established, we can enjoy their beauty and get a lot more diverse species into our forest. So we're not just planting New Zealand Christmas trees all across the city. Another good example of that is the Ginkgo biloba. We usually plant the autumn gold variety, which is a cultivar selected to be only male. So the female ginkgos produce a stinky fruit that's quite notorious. So we select these to be non-fruiting varieties. This tree on the left is a tree that FUF planted in 1983. This is on Eureka Street in 19th, I believe. So again, Eureka Valley, great growing climate. This is a tree that really does need a lot of sun. It needs wind protection, prefers warmth, and it doesn't really like that coastal influence that the west side of the city gets. So as you move further east, you get a lot more variety in terms of deciduous trees, a lot more variety in terms of where those trees come from. Whereas on the west side of the city, we're really planting trees that are going to be evergreen with thick, waxy leaves that are, native to more coastal environments. All right, so with that, it's time for another poll. Okay, so this question is, what's your favorite SF microclimate zone? Where do you like to spend the most of your time? As the host of the meeting, unfortunately, I'm prevented from participating, but once we end this in another 40 seconds or so, I can share my thoughts. I don't want to influence any of you or cause undue bias in your answers. All right, we have about another 21 seconds left before we have one more respondent. And again, use this time to please submit some questions in the chat so that we can know what's going through your head and potentially provide a response. All right, so that closes our second poll. The results are in. We have at number 1, tied for number 1, the transition zone and the sun belt with 7 votes each. We have the fog belt coming in with only 1 vote. I would add a second vote for the fog belt. I'm quite partial to it. I think fog is lovely. I like the trees that we plant, but it's also nice to get to different parts of the city. All right, moving on. We're gonna open up to different questions. So people, thank you for submitting your questions in the chat. I'm gonna hand this over to Anna and she'll take it from here.
All right, so we have a couple of questions. Again, feel free to submit them in the chat as we go through them. We'll have like 5 to 10 minutes for this. So let's see, starting out, someone wants to know why we can't plant more native trees and what are the native trees that we do plant in San Francisco?
That's a great question. So I first want to start by saying that we can plant native trees. We do. But it's just a matter of the sites that we have available to us to plant. So if you think about the species that are native to the city of San Francisco, you have trees like California buckeye, coast live oak, coast redwood, Pacific wax myrtle, maybe toyons or blue elderberry. And the latter ones, they're more shrubby than tree form. So if you think about planting a tree in the sidewalk, we really want to have a tree with what's called a standard form, which is one single trunk with clearance underneath and an elevated canopy. That way the tree is providing those ecosystem services, it's providing environmental benefits, but it's kind of out of the way of passing cars and pedestrians, which can cause damage to the tree. So absolutely, in a backyard or an open space, coast live oaks, buckeyes, redwoods even, can be a great option. In fact, if you're planting a tree in your backyard, there's no better tree than a coast live oak or maybe a ceanothus. But unfortunately, we're really limited by the dense urban environment, often just sidewalks that we're planting in.
Great, thanks for that answer, Mike. We have a question from Dan Z that I'm actually going to move to the next section because it really relates to the topic that we're covering there. So we will answer your question, but next section. We have another question on microclimates. Will the fog belt and sun belt species that we plant change as our city goes through climate change?
Yes. So specifically to the fog belt, there is a phenomenon that we are losing fog on the coast of California. Um, it's really hard to say what extent that will be. And frankly, it's hard to even get trees established in the fog belt. So that's something that we're constantly looking at is with the changing climate, how does that affect our species palette? One thing that I can say is that we're constantly looking south. We do expect a warmer, drier climate in the future. So one city that we look at very closely is Los Angeles. We see what they're planting. We see what they're taking out, more importantly. What's not thriving in that warmer, drier climate, because we do expect that in, 50 to 100 years, the climate of San Francisco largely will look more like the climate of Los Angeles. So we're kind of moving species north to expect that drier, warmer climate.
All right, and then we have one more question on microclimates. So how do you define which species are fast growing, and do slow growing trees have no hope of being planted in urban environments?
That's a great question. So fast growing or slow growing is relative. I mean, we're humans putting our own terms and perspectives on tree growth. I would say for a tree like Brisbane box, which is what I classified as fast growing, they can put on 3 to 4 feet of growth easily in a year, sometimes more than that if they have really good conditions. So I would call that fast growing. Slow growing trees might only be 6 inches in a year, or if a tree was planted in a spot that is unfavorable to it, it might grow almost none at all. So that's kind of the range of areas that we have. And it's not to say that slow growing trees can't be planted or established in San Francisco, or that they can't be great additions to our forests. It's just that they spend a lot more time at hand and truck level. So there's a lot more kind of pitfalls or potential hazards to deal with for a lot longer before they get that clearance.
Thanks, Mike. That looks like it's it for questions on microclimates, so I think we can move on.
Awesome. So now we're moving on to the site-specific conditions. So you have your microclimate, but you also have the conditions of the actual place that we're planting the tree at. At Friends of the Urban Forest, we're usually looking at a single property. And so this on the right is an example of the species matrix that we use to help people when they're selecting what tree to plant in front of their home. So you'll see that it has 3 main components. The first is street orientation. So that's, east-west oriented street, such as, maybe 16th Street or Geary, or a north-south street like Valencia or 19th Avenue. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important later. We also have overhead high voltage conflict or no overhead high voltage conflict. So we're all familiar with the overhead power lines that are pervasive throughout the city of San Francisco. Some of those carry high voltage electric current, some of them don't. The ones that do will influence tree species because we want to plant smaller trees. And then lastly, we have this sidewalk width column. And that's also important because that will influence the species that's selected for the site. We also look at city code and the built environment a little bit more deeply. And we'll talk about each one of these points starting now. So street orientation is big because the city of San Francisco is located at the tip of a peninsula, and we get wind whipping right off the Pacific Ocean through the bay. We're right at the tip of the peninsula, so that's where the wind naturally wants to flow. It doesn't want to go over the mountains of Marin or lower in the peninsula. It wants to go right through the Golden Gate. So we are exposed to significant amounts of wind, and the east-west oriented streets, again, like Geary or like Lincoln or Fulton or 16th Street, 24th Street, those are streets that by and large are oriented in the exact same direction that the wind wants to travel. So they're kind of like little wind tunnels, and so they get far more exposure to wind than north-south streets. Where those trees actually get a lot of protection from the buildings. So those buildings kind of break up the wind. They act as a natural windbreak and create little microclimates even within a neighborhood where you have, areas of higher or lower wind exposure. So these photos here are the same species, photos of the same species, Agonis flexuosa, it's a peppermint willow. One of them is planted on an east-west street on Flood Street, right next to City College, kind of in the Alamany Gap area. If you're familiar with that, it's kind of an area that's known for being a huge wind corridor. And on the right, we have the same species that's planted on, I think this is 45th Avenue in the Richmond. So, if you looked at that climate zone map with the fog, the transition, and the sun belt, the tree on the left that's very windblown would actually fall in the transition zone, and the tree on the right would fall just about as far west as possible in the fog belt. But you have completely different outcomes for the same species based entirely on the site. So this just highlights that that is a really big factor that we have to deal with when selecting tree species in the city of San Francisco. Another one that we look at is overhead high voltage lines. So PG&E inspects its high voltage lines every year, and they maintain at minimum 4 feet of clearance of all vegetation around those lines. But that doesn't mean that they only prune to 4 feet, because they'd be back every single year. So if they need to prune something, they'll often hit it back a lot harder than that minimum clearance. And that results in diminished canopy, which results in diminished environmental benefits from those trees. And that means that the trees, by and large, are more expensive and are providing less benefits, or fewer benefits. So here on these two pictures, these two trees are both New Zealand Christmas trees, or pohutukalas. They were both planted by Friends of the Urban Forest in 1983. And so and they're actually on the same block in Noe Valley. So here you have a really good example of, one tree planted underneath high voltage lines, what that looks like after almost 40 years, and another tree that was planted in a site that allows it to actually express its full character. And the difference is stark. And if you multiply that out over thousands of trees, the difference in canopy that's lost by planting the wrong tree under those high voltage lines and the expense of maintaining them is quite significant. And this is how we actually identify what has high voltage and what doesn't. So any pole that carries high voltage electric current will have a yellow sticker that says high voltage on it. If it doesn't have that, so down here we have a utility pole that carries power, it carries communication lines, but it doesn't have high voltage electric on it, then you can still plant a large stature tree. And oftentimes we do encourage that, because you really do maximize the benefits of a larger canopy. But anytime you have these high voltage current, or these high voltage wires, you really want to plant a low stature tree that will not grow tall enough to get into those wires. So a good example of a tree that we often plant underneath high voltage wires is a bronze loquat, Eriobotrya deflexa. Again, on the left, you can tell by the form that this is a really good candidate for that sort of planting, because it has sort of a low squat, like a low and spreading form, so that you still get decent canopy cover, you still get the benefits associated with that, but you just don't get that tree height. And you can imagine, even if this tree does kind of start to get near those wires, if they top it, or they kind of try to reduce it a little bit, it's not going to have an overwhelming effect on the form or function of that tree in the urban landscape. Whereas if we look at a tree such as the primrose, or the Lagunaria patersonii, you can tell just by the size and the form of this tree that this is not going to be a good species to plant under high voltage lines. It's very erect. It's a very vertically growing tree. It can get up to maybe 40 feet in San Francisco. I don't think anyone's ever seen one reach full maturity, so the jury's still out just how tall they can get. And you can see that if this was under high voltage lines and they came by and reduced it, that would be a significant impact and take out a significant part of that tree. So this is also what we would call fast growing, which would need to be, require even more maintenance to maintain. The other thing we look at is sidewalk width. So we try to think of the tree in place, and we look at the long-term impacts of that tree. So we measure sidewalk width as if you're walking down the street, you spread your arms left and right. How far left and right do you have before you hit from the curb to whatever that first impediment is? In the case of this photo on the left, the first impediment is the wall. So you have a 6-foot sidewalk from the curb to the wall. In this photo on the right, we're looking at a 15-foot sidewalk. And you can see the impacts that concrete damage, hardscape damage caused by these trees has on the usability of each one of these sidewalks. On the left, does this look like something you'd want to take a jog down or push a stroller down or do something like that? The sidewalk is almost completely unusable. Whereas on the right, you still have significant concrete damage caused by the roots of this tree, but you also still have this really nice usable path of travel on the left. And that's the really lovely benefit of these wide sidewalks. You can set the tree back, you can plant a larger stature tree. In this case, this is a Brazilian pepper tree. Friends of the Urban Forest came and put a New Zealand Christmas tree, Pahudakawa, here, because this is a much better site where we can actually expand this basin. Whereas here, same species, Pahudakawa, it's just totally taking over that whole sidewalk. Lastly, and this is a lot of info, so kind of don't pay much attention to these restrictions over here. We are limited by underground utilities. So we have gas, electric, communication lines that litter our sidewalks. And so we need to plant around that, and we just need to avoid them as best we can. Luckily, they all get marked. And so those are things that don't necessarily influence tree species as much as tree location. Some things, you can expect more potential hardscape damage from certain species, but largely this is just something that affects where we can put trees. So if a homeowner or somebody who's asking for a tree really wants it in one spot, sometimes we can accommodate that and sometimes we can't. And sometimes we can't plant a tree in front of a house at all. So we're done with the site-specific section. Time to test your knowledge. So we're gonna start a new poll here, give you another minute to respond. The question for this poll is, which of the following tree species should not be planted under high voltage electric lines? This one might be a little bit of an advanced question. All right, so we're reaching about the halfway point of this poll. We're giving you all about another 30 seconds to respond. So hedge your bets, place your bets, take a big gulp and take a leap of whatever you're thinking. Just commit to it and we'll share the results. It's a very low stakes game we're playing. Ten seconds left. And we will close it there. So we have 14 responses. Oh, we had 16 responses. Wow, great response rate on that one. You all were really excited to choose your species. So we had an overwhelming majority of people who were voted for the Brisbane box, and that is correct. That tree can get up to 45 feet tall or potentially even taller in San Francisco. And it does have a more upright form, so not a good tree to plant under high voltage lines, where we are restricted to only smaller stature trees. All right, and we're moving on to the question and answer section for the site-specific factors. So if you haven't already, please shoot your questions into the Zoom chat and Anna will field them.
All right, and we've got several really good questions that we can dive right into on site-specific factors. So question one, why do some tree roots grow exposed above the sidewalk and other species grow only below the dirt line? Does FUF favor species that have roots growing down so as to avoid sidewalk damage?
Yeah, great question. So there's a few aspects to that. So I think what probably triggered was the New Zealand Christmas trees that have been shown. And those are, you have to think about where those are kind of to, what environments those are adapted to grow in, which is kind of a constantly shifting sandy environment. And so they don't really want to put one or a couple major roots down. They really hedge their bets and they're constantly growing roots. Other roots, other trees have what's called lignotubers, which is a fire response adaptation where they have those big bulbous bases, that big root flare. And that basically is so that if the tree succumbs to fire damage, the top of the tree will die, but the bottom of that tree, that lignotuber, can resprout. So that's also another thing that you see a lot. We definitely try to take root damage potential into account when selecting tree species. So, you know, that New Zealand is kind of the quintessential example. But there are others that are known to, you know, be worse or be better with coexisting in the sidewalk. So we do take that into account, but ultimately, you know, if we're planting right on Ocean Beach, it's really that New Zealand Christmas tree or nothing, or maybe a Cordyline australis.
All right, thanks, Mike. So we've got the next question. How does FUF identify new species and cultivars that may be appropriate for the city? And they say that we need more biodiversity.
So I totally agree with that second statement. We do need biodiversity. Tree species diversity across the forest level is resilience, specifically climate resilience, pest and pathogen resilience. So we're always looking to add new trees and find new species that will grow really well in our climate and coexist in an urban space like San Francisco. We have annually, all the main stakeholders of the city of San Francisco will meet to discuss potential additions to the city's approved street tree list, which is hosted by Public Works. That involves the Urban Forestry Council. It involves a lot of other urban forestry and arborist professionals who come from different places, you know. So we have people come in from, you know, who are more experienced in California or other parts of the world even, and they will share their recommendations, you know, what works in Australia, what works in certain parts of Hawaii even. And oftentimes it just comes down to experimentation and monitoring and adjustment.
Great. We have a question about tree selection with homeowners. So if you have to consider all of these site-specific factors, do homeowners get much of a choice when they're choosing tree species?
Great question. So we try to provide that matrix as a tool that people can use to help sift or help filter some of the, you know, because if we just gave everyone a list of all 60 trees on the approved street tree list and only 8 of them were plantable at their site, that would be a lot of stress and time spent just filtering it down. So we try to filter it to about 3 trees that people can select. But ultimately, if somebody has a tree that they really love and they really want to plant, we encourage them to still ask. And if we can plant it, we will. And I think that community engagement is a really important tool, not only for, you know, people to be connected to their tree, but also to foster more diversity in what we're planting. Because it's really easy for us to, you know, feel comfortable with the same 3 or 5 trees. But when people are kind of pushing that envelope a little bit, it does force us to look a little bit beyond what we're most familiar with or what's most available. So we try to help people choose in a way that streamlines the process and makes it easier on them. But we are open to things that are not necessarily one of those 3 that are recommended.
All right, thanks. So I think that's it for site-specific factor questions. If you asked another question and it hasn't been answered yet, we'll answer it later in the presentation. So
Awesome.
Don't worry about that. We're actually going to bump over to our community engagement team for a little bit. They have a short announcement for all the volunteers. So Jesus, let me unmute you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Anna. And thank you to everyone that came to this meeting, and some of you that came to my webinar last week as well. I appreciate you. So you might have heard me say it last week, but right now we're all stuck in our houses. It's a little rough, and aside from a few essential operations, we can't be outdoors either. But we'd really like to return to your neighborhoods ready to plant as many trees as possible. And we're really counting on our neighborhood organizers and people like yourselves to help us spread the words that we can plant free trees and let people pick species and like all of what FUF does. So if you have any interest in helping us spread the word, whether through your social medias, your next doors, or your email group, I'm going to paste a link into the chat right now. If you can follow that and let us know, it's a form. If you could fill out the form just to let us know that you're interested, we'll get back to you with more information as to how you can help us out to make sure we can hit the ground running once we're all back in the field. Thank you so much again, Anna, and thank all of you one more time.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jesus. All right, so I think we're ready to move on to the next question, or not question, section. So I'll hand it back over to Mike. Hey, Mike,
right.
Sorry.
On mute. So I just wanted to point out that these questions are really awesome. Everybody's been, quality of the content coming from you is amazing. Please keep it up. And we'll have another section at the end for more questions. So please keep hitting that chat box with more good questions and comments. So another section that we look at very closely is cultural and aesthetic values. So here I think that the easiest way to explain this is using examples. So on the left, this photo is Folsom Street in Mission and Bernal. And this is an example of an aesthetic value where that entire street was planted in a boulevard fashion with Chinese elms, which have a very unique character. They're very large, spreading canopy. They kind of have that almost weeping form. And so there's a lot of value to that. And when thinking about, tree species selection in a site like that, if we were to plant another tree on Folsom in that part of it, it would probably be a Chinese elm because there's such significant value to that kind of aesthetic, that boulevard style planting. Another good example is Civic Center here. These are pollarded London plane trees. So pollarding is, I believe, a French peasantry tradition that started with, French presence in the olden times, and has really taken off in San Francisco, and that's celebrated here at City Hall. And so it would be entirely inappropriate if for one of those, if they died, for us to go in and replace it with, say, a redwood. Not only just because of the site and the microclimate being potentially limiting factors, but also because it would be completely out of place with the general aesthetic and the current use of that site. Another really good example is Japantown. So on the right here, this is Japantown. You'll notice that flowering cherry in the foreground. And for those of us who've planted with Friends of the Urban Forest for a long time, you'll notice that we've really moved away from flowering cherries and the purpley plums because we find that their lifespan is shortened because of our season and our climates. They aren't really the best bang for your buck, so to speak, in terms of environmental benefit. But when it comes to Japantown, we plant cherry trees, no questions asked, because they have a very compelling cultural connection to that tree. And so that's really important when thinking about the longevity of trees, the use of the trees, the addition of a tree to a space, and the connection that people that inhabit that space. It's really important to consider that when selecting species or making recommendations or planting or even removing certain tree species. So with that, time to test your knowledge one more time. And we're gonna have another quick question pop up. Any second now.
Did it load?
And we're gonna, did it load? I'm not seeing it.
Okay, I've got a poor internet connection. Maybe you can start the poll this time, Mike.
I'm getting an error 4401. Let's try it. Okay, here we go. cultural aesthetic question. What is not a relevant or cultural or aesthetic factor to consider? And I should say that I skipped over one important topic in mentioning cultural considerations. So I'll give you eliminate one response from this question. Feng Shui is a tradition, and there are parts of Feng Shui that call for not planting a tree directly in front of a front door. And we try to respect that as much as possible. So that's another thing that we consider and that we take into account. If somebody asks us not to plant a tree or don't put it there, that's a totally valid reason, and we respect that. So Feng Shui is a relevant cultural or aesthetic factor to consider, so don't choose. It's really pollarding, boulevard style planting, or tree topping. Which of those is not relevant, not considered a valid cultural or aesthetic value in tree selection? All right, so we're going a little over on time for this poll. 1 minute and 8 seconds. The poll is closed. We have 13 responses. All have selected tree topping, and that really makes me a proud presenter, because tree topping is different from pollarding in that pollarding does have a kind of cultural and aesthetic value to it. Tree topping is simply poor management practices. So on to questions and concerns. I'll hand it back over to Anna.
All right. That might have been a kind of easy poll, but y'all did so great. So I actually have a question. I haven't gotten any questions about cultural and aesthetic from folks, but you mentioned earlier that we plant male ginkgos for aesthetic and odor reasons. Are there any cons to planting only male ginkgos?
There are, and it's not necessarily specific to ginkgos, but the reason we plant male only ginkgos is because they don't produce fruit. And that's a concern that a lot of arborists and urban foresters share, and the general public shares. And so there's been a trend over the past several decades of planting more and more male variety trees. The downside to that is that the male, while it doesn't produce fruit, it does produce pollen. And so you have basically forests that are becoming more and more populated with these male cultivars. And so they're producing more and more pollen. And you know, at scale, that's probably not a good thing. So there is that downside, but not necessarily, we can't blame ginkgos for it, but it is a step in that direction.
All right, thanks for that. We haven't really gotten any other questions on cultural or aesthetic value, so I think we can move on to just opening it up to a broader Q&A.
Awesome. So we did save some questions from earlier in the webinar to address at the end. But I also want to just talk about some of the trees selected for this final slide. So in the center, we have a couple fernleaf Catalina ironwoods, and you can just see how well these trees have done. These are very well sited trees. They're clearly the site conditions are very conducive to their growth. The form matches the site very well. It's so vertical with that building there. So I would consider that a really good example of kind of long-term success in tree siting. The trees on the picture on the left and on the right are both taken with permission from Mike Sullivan's Trees of San Francisco book. These are both in his blog, actually, sftrees.com. And these are both landmark trees in San Francisco. On the left is a New Zealand Christmas Hurakawa, just a really awesome individual tree because it has a yellow flower. And you can see it has a nice big tree basin to accommodate that species. So that's a really awesome tree. And you can see that it's very, very mature. And that's what we want. We want to see our trees reach maturity and be healthy and provide the maximum amount of benefits as they can. The other tree, this picture on the right, this kind of touches on all of the points that we talked about in this presentation. Not only are blue gum eucalyptus fantastic fits for the San Francisco climate, for better or for worse, but in this location, you can see you have this big 5-6 foot diameter tree, but it has this huge sidewalk and it has this big space. And so they're actually coexisting really well. And I also mentioned that these are landmark trees because these were actually planted by Mary Ellen Pleasant, who is a hugely important figure in San Francisco and California civil rights. So she was a entrepreneur, an abolitionist, and a civil rights activist, often called the mother of human rights in California. And these were planted by her some point in the late 1800s. And so you can see that that longevity is really tied closely to selecting the right tree for the right site. And the results, if done well, can be really amazing and last for generations to come.
Great.
So, yeah, back to you, Anna.
Sorry for jumping in there. And I just wanted to point out that Josh just posted a link to Mary Ellen Pleasant's Wikipedia page, which is really great. So that's in the chat if you're interested in reading that. And let me also say before we wrap up the Q&A session that at the end we have just a quick feedback survey that we'd really appreciate you sticking around for. So bear with us, and we're going to answer a couple of exciting, fun questions, keep you all engaged.
And while we answer some of those questions, we're actually going to start that feedback survey now. I think it's 4 questions, so just feel free to move through at your own pace. And we'll take some questions from the chat while you all are filling out the feedback survey. We really do appreciate you all attending and contributing to this webinar. And your feedback is really important to us in terms of hosting future webinars or not, and what the content and format of those will be. So please be honest and constructive in your feedback. And with that, back to Anna.
Hey, Mike, I'm getting an error when I'm trying to launch the polling. If you wouldn't mind trying that on your end. Sorry about the technical glitches. While Mike is starting that, great. So the first question that we have is, in tree care, is watering or pruning more expensive long-term?
Great question. And that term, the different time scale is really important to that. So on the short term, if you look at the cost of planting and establishing a tree, in general, it works out to about $2,000 per tree. And that breaks down to about roughly $500 to plant it and roughly $500 to water it every year. So that's $1,500 worth of that initial $2,000 investment towards watering. Long-term tree care definitely outstrips that. A single tree care visit for a mature tree, if it's a really technical job, would be $2,000 or more. But that long-term care is really where that payoff is, by providing care throughout the tree's life and not just waiting until it's 20 or 25 years and needs substantial work. That's where you really gain some of that expense back.
Awesome. So we've got another question about wind damage. Are some trees less susceptible to wind damage than others? And what characteristics do you look for if you have to plant on an east-west street like Geary?
Yeah, so we look first, what's growing well on the street. So if a tree is, there's 5 of one species on the street and they all look great, that's a good sign that that tree will be a good fit for the site. On the other hand, if they all look really lopsided, they're flagging, all their growth is on the downwind side, we would want to choose something else. And really, we look mainly towards our institutional knowledge with 40 years of planting in San Francisco. The one thing, there's really great resources throughout the state of California for tree characteristics in terms of soil and climate, like USDA hardiness zones and sunset climate zones. But the wind resistance is one thing that has yet to really be pinned down. So that's one thing that we're kind of still working on and still, using process of elimination and constantly updating our lists based on what does well and what doesn't.
Great, thanks. We've got another question. So even with 3 wooden stakes, why do some trees grow at an angle? How do we keep trees growing straight up?
Great question. The first thing I would say is that it's not always a bad thing, or it's not inherently bad for a tree to be growing at an angle, as long as that tree grows in that kind of position to start with, and it's not a recently developed lean. So when looking at things like tree risk, if a tree is growing straight up and then develops a lean later, that's kind of an issue and that's a concern. But if the tree is growing with a lean, and that lean is kind of almost like organic to the tree's growth, the tree will respond to that. But we do like to see trees grow as straight up as possible in an urban environment like San Francisco. And that just comes to readjusting the ties often, selecting the right tree for the right site, and also to an extent, pruning it correctly.
All right, last chance for any other questions submitted through the chat.
All right, well, thank you everybody so much for coming out. I really appreciate fielding all your questions. It's nice to get a chance to see people's names pop up in the chat. I've been missing all of you, and I hope that we can all get back out to the field to start planting trees again as soon as possible.
Yep. And we just wanted to mention that we will have more webinars coming up in the future, so we'll stay in touch with those.
Yes, and your feedback to the current poll that's going right now in progress is critical to shaping our future webinars. So if this was interesting to you, or if it wasn't interesting to you, please give us feedback so we know, what topics might be a little bit more in line with your interests. Great. Well, I think that we can end the webinar. Thank you again so much for everybody for your attendance. Huge thank you to Anna for initiating the idea of webinars and for moderating, being such a successful moderator. Again, stay tuned for more updates. We are hoping to offer more webinars as we move into this digital urban forestry period of our organizations. So thank you all again, and I hope to see and talk with you in the near future. And Patricia, thank you for your feedback in the chat. If you have any other questions or feedback for us, including topics for future webinars, you can email to info@fuf.net. We're always accepting suggestions, recommendations, and feedback. Cool, and with I will end the polling and we will end the webinar. So thank you everybody so much, and be sure to check back